Let's have some more fun. Democracy is so exciting. In 90 seconds, please state your name, the office you are seeking, and then answer the following question. What do you think are the most important solutions at the state level to address sea level rise and flooding? This is a minute and a half.
My name is Phil Moore, and I am running to be the next state representative in District 53. District 53 is the south portion of the county, runs from 192 south to the county line. For me, sea level rise can be attributed very simply to greenhouse gases and CO2 emissions. So if we look at ways that we can reduce greenhouse gases and CO2 emissions, we will then be helping to address the first beginnings of stopping sea level rise. It's already occurring, so we need to work on that. That's going to be the simple answer. How we achieve that is going to be the more complicated portion. Whether we look at renewable resources, solar energy, those are going to be the ways that we reduce greenhouse gases.
Thank you. My name is Thad Altman. We're not running each other. I'm in District 52, which you are in right now. It basically runs from South Cocoa Beach to South Melbourne Beach and from around Vieira down to 192. I'm running for re-election. I want to commend you for having this forum. This is a huge issue and such an important issue, and I've dedicated much of my life fighting for environmental issues such as this. What can we do? Gosh, you know, the first thing, we have a huge public opinion challenge ahead of us. We have got to convince people that global warming is a reality, especially people in my party, a Republican. There's so many Republicans that are just in complete and total denial. And I actually have worked in the field of conservation trying to convince Republicans that we need to wake up. We've sort of lost the party of Teddy Roosevelt. And I think a lot of it has to do with special interests, but a lot of it's just simply the lack of knowledge. Global warming is a reality. The National Academy of Sciences has overwhelmingly warned us that global warming is happening. The science is just completely and totally overwhelming. It's not only global science, but it's also science in the lab, basic chemistry. CO2, methane stores heat. And we're dumping a ton of that into our atmosphere that is very fragile.
Thank you. So this is our first question for, or with a minute response time. According to Flood IQ data, in 2032, sea level rise plus a Category 3 hurricane would cause flooding-related damage to 1,703,466 homes in Florida. What can we do now to protect these areas?
Thank you. This is a more complicated question. Beach renourishment is something that we've done, and in certain areas of Florida, that might be the way we want to continue, depending on the height of the beach and the duning and everything. Managed land use is what I would say we're going to be looking at, and that's going to be managing retreat. We'll be looking at if erosion is occurring at a rate that is not going to be sustainable or feasible to add more beaches to. Looking at conservation of areas, rezoning of areas. So it's a long list of planning and looking at to see where it's happening, where the flooding is happening, and what our best avenue to treat that. It's going to be varying in different portions of the state.
I think as we go through this segment, one thing I want to emphasize is that there are two approaches to this problem of climate change. One is a very short-term approach, and the other is the long-term. I think it's important that we don't allow the short-term approaches to overshadow the reality we need to make changes for the long term and hopefully prevent this disaster that's imminent. But immediate knowledge. This past session, I advocated for a $17 million appropriation to do LiDAR mapping, very high resolution mapping. Local company, Harris Corporation, leads the world in this mapping. That will help us define these floodplains within inches so people will know that they live in a flood-prone area. And once we find those flood-prone areas, we'll need to think about mitigation, whether it's moving people out. There's already a mitigation type of program with the Federal Flood Insurance Program. There's financial incentives to move away from flood-prone areas. My time's up. Boy, that 90 seconds goes faster up here.
These questions are just 1 minute.
Oh, 1 minute. Okay.
1 minute.
Yes,
Now-
1
That
minute.
was a very short 90 seconds.
Right.
This question's fun. What policies can be put into place to avoid the long power outages like we experienced in Hurricane Irma?
Yeah, so one of the things that I spoke with a person from Emergency Management Services, and I was discussing with them, I'm like, why don't we have more solar panels on our services that require energy? And we're looking at generating backups through generators. And so one of the things that I would look at would be having these solar panels on their battery backup so that we don't have these outages, especially with our water management system. These could have solar panels on them with a battery backup, and they could generate all the power they need. We're not worrying about loss of power through FPL, but that's, again, working against the special interest groups of FPL, but I think it can be done. It needs to be done.
Well, rethink energy, I think that's what we need to do, sort of the theme of this forum. First, put our power lines underground, the most easy and quick way to fix that problem. But also, distributive electricity, alternative energy, solar production on your homes. You know, I sponsored bills in the Florida Senate when I was there, fighting for renewable energies and fighting for distributive energy production, which the big utilities fight. And I have gone up against them. We were not successful, but we did win a victory with the recent constitutional amendment that passed. So utilities on the ground, but also, when I say distributive energy, producing more energy at the local level, at the home level, on the rooftop, or in the neighborhood, or the apartment complexes. So you don't have this very intricate maze of ugly power lines running everywhere. They get blown down. And they want to cut down the trees to save the power lines. That doesn't make sense.
Okay. What role should the state education system play in education on sea level rise? Is there an education program that you would champion? Let's go with Mr. Altman.
Well, I certainly would support, I think it has great scientific merit, and it's a fact that we teach our children in our classes, our biology class, our meteorology class, that sea level rise is a reality. You know, there are a lot of politicians that don't want to admit that it's a reality, but we can't deprive our children from the truth. So I think I would advocate any program that is science-based and communicates to the youth the reality of sea level rise. I think open dialogue is important, and I think we need to give both sides. But what's interesting, the other side of this argument typically are not scientists. They're political talking heads or lobbyists that are hired by perhaps carbon producers. But I would definitely support more education in terms of reality. It's going to affect our future generations. Those are the ones that are going to really suffer.
Well, I think when we look towards education, we actually look towards groups like yourselves. These nonprofit organizations are the ones that are putting out the materials on the science. And that's where we look towards, or at least I do, to make sure that I'm getting the facts and the information that I need to help make some of the best decisions. So that's where I would say we need to continue seeing the education come from. It's from the nonprofits, the ones who don't have a stake and are just going to bring forth the science, not the lobbyists. And like as Representative Altman said, not the other groups that are doing it for political reasons.
Under what conditions do you feel it is appropriate to use tax dollars to fund sea level rise resilience activities? And what efforts, if any, would you champion in the state legislature to fund sea level rise and flood resilience efforts?
So this would go again to how we're going to manage the land. We would look at, managed retreat. We would look at rezoning setbacks. Eventually, we're going to have to look at buying some land too, depending on how the land starts valuing. As people see that the water is encroaching upon their properties, the value of the home is going to decrease. And when that happens, we're going to have to look at ways that we're going to have to be able to buy back that land. So those are a few ways that I would use tax dollars to make sure that we're doing that. That's proactive thinking, rather than waiting for them, for everything to fall apart. So I would use a more proactive approach and see what we can do to stop it from people developing on land. I wouldn't be for that. Try to stop it, whether we create conservation lands, use money towards that, but try to be more active with the money we're spending.
Well, we're going to have to use public funds to do the things we need to do to prevent the negative effects of sea level rise. I think first and foremost is land acquisition for those sensitive lands. The most important way of protecting the public and the most cost-effective way of protecting the environment is acquiring land that's fragile in nature and vulnerable. That's why I worked so hard in Amendment 1 a number of years ago to restore our Florida Forever land acquisition program. And unfortunately, the legislature just completely ignored that. But we've won a very major court case. Probably will end up in the Supreme Court, and I hope and pray that we'll prevail. But other sources of there are roads that are in danger. We'll have to maybe redirect some of our gas tax revenues to armor those roads. We need to perhaps look at a fee-based structure for those who are creating the problem, perhaps carbon producers, to pay more of their fair share to help mitigate the problem.
Okay, let's go to our first audience question. It's one of those groups that you mentioned. The Citizens Climate Lobby and others are proposing a bipartisan policy of steadily increasing revenue neutral carbon tax, with the money returned to equal shares to every American household. Would you support national and state legislation to put such a policy in place? Let's go with Mr. Thad. Or Mr. Wall.
I think a carbon fee is a good idea, and I think the best appropriation of those dollars is through tax incentives or grants to those who want to invest in alternative energy sources that would further lower the carbon footprint. It simply makes sense if we generate that revenue, let's in return spend it in a way that will actually help us reduce the carbon footprint even greater. So I support that. It's an idea that's not new. It was a part of the Kyoto Protocol, which the U.S. chose not to be a part of. Neither did China, which is now the largest carbon producer, not per capita, but in terms of carbon. So yes, I think those are the kind of things we need to do to avert this incredible disaster that we're facing.
Like Representative Altman, I also support a carbon fee and dividend, which would then give back the dividends back to the user, the people, the taxpayers, to be able to have those funds. And creating that fee hopefully will incentivize the producers of those powers to look towards alternative energy sources, so they're not getting the fee on the carbon emissions. So yeah, I completely support that.
What is your single most significant personal or professional accomplishment regarding sea level rise, the environment, energy conservation, or sustainability?
So I spent a little time this last legislative session actually lobbying for some environmental issues for no fracking. I met with Representative Altman and Senator Mayfield, and was able to hopefully help with my efforts to convince them on those. Also, I've done some work in the Indian River Lagoon. I've added some oyster beds down. I actually did fish cleanup during a bad fish kill, which was not fun, but it needed to be done. I'm an environmentalist. I ride my bike when I can to try to save on gas, and I own a Prius, which helps too.
Well, I think being the author of the Brevard County Environmental Lands Program is one of the things that I look back on and most honored to have been a part of and spearhead. I was also one of the founding members of the Florida Conservation Alliance, now the Florida Conservation Voters. We put the Amendment 1 on the ballot and got it passed, and that would probably be my greatest achievement, except for, again, the legislature has refused to implement it. I'm just praying that we get a good court that will acknowledge that the people of Florida need to be heard. Those two things. I did sponsor the Everglades Restoration Act 2 years ago. Senator Negron was the Senate sponsor, I was the House. Probably one of the largest environmental bills to ever pass the Florida legislature. So those are probably my three.
As sea level rises and coastal Floridians are displaced from their homes, there is the potential for large numbers of climate refugees to migrate to different areas of the state. How do you propose the state prepare for this potential shift in the state's population?
I don't know. I took the last one.
Well, I think good land use planning. Unfortunately, we missed an opportunity to do some great things in land use planning back in the 80s when I was a county commissioner, when Governor Bob Martinez appointed the Urban Sprawl Task Force. And basically, it was a European model. Basically, all of our urban areas would have urban service boundaries drawn around them, and you were not allowed to have development outside of those urban centers until they were full, which meant you would have vibrant urban centers, a denser population, mass transit, and you would have a green belt that would be protected and preserved. Had we done that, we would be in a lot better condition than we are now in Florida. That, when I say no densities, in your rural areas, maybe 1 unit to 40 acres, 1 unit to 20 at the most, but we don't do a very good job of protecting our green belt in this country. They do in Europe because they've had to do it. We haven't overcome this pioneer mentality. We have unlimited resources, but we're going to have to.
Yeah, I'd follow that up with just making sure we have proper regulations in place so that people be more proactive again, that people aren't developing and building on those areas that we know that they're going to flood and that they're going to need to move in a few years or 10 years down the road. So we want to make sure that if that is an area that's going to be a problem, that we address it now versus later and not let them develop on that land and then realize that we've got to have them move and find a new place for them to go.
Do you think cities and counties in Florida should have access to state funds for flood mitigation projects? Why or why not?
Yeah, absolutely. Cities and municipalities around the area are going to need our support from the state level. We want to make sure, I would want to make sure that I work with them and do what I can at the state to try to help them mitigate as best they can so that we're not worrying about, again, having these areas of development that we're going to have to worry about paying off more later versus less now to have that so that we're not worrying about the development there.
Absolutely. A lot of times it's difficult for one community to burden the total cost of any sort of flood event or the need for flood mitigation. So I think Florida needs to be considered a one state. We work together as a pool to remedy these problems. We'll be much more successful if we do. 70% of the state's wealth is produced by the coastal region, but yet the coastal region is most prone to flooding. So if we produce the wealth, we certainly deserve to have some of those statewide resources come back to the coastal region. Also, if we lose the economic viability of some of our coastal regions, it could have a significant negative impact on the Florida economy. So I hear that a lot when we have the insurance debate, right? They want the folks that live on the coast to pay higher insurance rates. But the reality is, we're paying a lot more taxes. There are a lot of nice roads in inland part of the state because of the economic vibrancy that we produce. So I think that we need a one pool effect.
Okay, let's do an audience question. What solutions will you introduce in order to ensure an adequate budget for state road infrastructure to be updated to account for sea level rise?
So we're going to have to add another fee in my estimation, because we have infrastructure that is so old that we've not been paying in on it, so we have a lot of work and a lot to have to fix. There's a number of different fees you could look at. One idea, if we're looking at carbon emissions, we could look at something that I was looking at was the weight of the vehicle. And if the vehicle weighs more, it could add an extra fee to the weight of the vehicle. Obviously, we know that vehicles that weigh more put more damage on the roads. So if you bought a large truck, you would pay more for that large truck because it's going to do more damage on the road, and it's also going to eat up more fuel, so it's going to have a higher emissions.
I agree with that approach. I think fee-based is much more, I'm certainly against a flat tax or a tax in general, but a fee-based approach where the more impact you have on a road network, the more you should pay. Gas taxes have actually gone down dramatically. And the reason they've gone down is because vehicles are much more fuel efficient. So we're beginning to see our transportation infrastructure crumble because revenues are way down. Now we're seeing the introduction of hybrid and electric vehicles. Wonderful. But what that means, again, we're going to see revenue drop to maintain an adequate road system. So we're going to need to get creative. And I like the idea of those who continue to get the big gas guzzlers should pay more. I know I do.
Let's see. What are some of your concerns and solutions for affordable housing in disasters like hurricanes?
Well, first of all, make sure homes are built properly. I know when I was on the commission in '85, we really fought for laws that required all homes built on the barrier island to be rated at 140 mile per hour wind load. And we were shot out of the saddle on that one. And wow, if we would have done that then, it was 1985, we would not have the disasters that we've had due to hurricanes since, would not have the fluctuations in insurance premiums that we've had since. It would have been a simple solution, minimal cost to the homeowners. So prevention, first and foremost. When homes are destroyed, we do have better codes to make sure that they are built to better standards. But also economic incentives for retrofit homes to address the problems that may be related to wind load, better roofs, better windows.
And I would just add that I would look at the value of the home and the homestead exemption and how old the home is as to how much they're going to need in terms of economic help. So if it's a newer home, it should be set to newer standards. They should need as much as somebody who's possibly lived in their home for the last 50, 60 years, who might be on a fixed income. So I would look at that as a standard, the age of the home and how long somebody's homesteaded in that home to how much help they need.
Decades of plastic pollution have been building up in our oceans and on our beaches. What policy positions are you interested in seeing implemented to deal with this issue?
So for me, when we look at plastics, and I'm an advocate for home rule, and for me, this deals with the home rule issue. You would want to allow the municipalities or the coastal cities to put in ordinances in place that would, if they wanted to ban plastic straws, if they wanted to go to removing plastic bags in their city and going towards reusable bags, I would leave that up to the city to put that ordinance in place. So I would be in favor of allowing them the flexibility of putting in the ordinances that they see fit in their communities.
We need legislation immediately to deal with the plastic crisis. And what we found, I sat on the Natural Resources Committee in the House. We had a very interesting presentation. We're finding that a lot of the plastics that recycle are not being recycled. A lot of those plastics are being shipped to China. They're closing their doors. They don't want to be flooded with plastic. You see massive areas of our oceans being filled with plastics. We need to mandate a higher percentage of plastics be recycled. We need to have more accountability. We need to, we were headed in the right direction. Again, I'll go back to the 80s and 90s, but we've sort of slipped, and we've got to get back on track and mandate a certain degree of recycling. But also, I sat on a committee on the National Association of Counties, is containers. We look at the end of the waste stream, but we need to look at the other side, how containers are produced, and have more reusable containers, and how we provide products in a more environment friendly way at the sell side. I wanted to hear that, but thank you.
Let's go with an audience question. And this one's pretty important. At the state legislature, how will you deal with people who don't agree that climate change is an issue or even a reality?
Oh my gosh, that is a good question. It is probably the most frustrating thing. Basic science, scream, shout, pull my hair out, I don't know. I think that's our number one challenge. Our number one challenge is get the word out that this is a reality and we must address it. If we don't win that battle, we lose. And this forum is why I'm so excited to be here. So we must get the word out. It's become a big partisan issue. If you know a Republican that knows the reality of sea level rise and what it's doing to our environment, spread the word. I don't know how many Republicans we have here, but tell your Republican friends if you're a Democrat, because we need to elect people from both parties. It's a serious political battle that we have. I've just watched an inconvenient sequel. How many have seen that? Well done. I commend Al Gore in his effort to get the word out through documentary films, and we just need to continue those type of things.
Well, hopefully I'll be dealing with that issue when I get up in Tallahassee. More than just smile and nod my head in agreeance and knowing that it's totally different. But that is the fundamental difference between somebody who looks at the science and recognizes that we have the biggest impact in the last 50 years versus those who just say this is just the way the cycle of the earth works and it's just going to all fall right back to normalcy afterwards, later on. So just making sure that I present what I know or directing them to other information and other scientific data. That would be how I approach that.
How does renewable energy relate to sea level rise? What, if anything, should be done to promote renewable energy in Florida?
So renewable energy is what we want to move towards because we're trying to get away from greenhouse gases and CO2 emissions. Those are what are causing our climate to rise, which is burning off our ice caps and glaciers and everything. That's why they're melting, and that's what's increasing our sea level. So if we can move towards those more sustainable resources, wind, solar, and move away from those fossil fuels, which are finite, that's the ultimate goal. So I think I answered that.
Yes. Yeah. I think one of the incredible things I learned in sponsoring some of the renewable energy legislation that I have is that one way is free markets and freedom and entrepreneurship and getting rid of monopolies. Renewable energy in many ways is much more affordable than massive nuclear power plants or massive coal-fired plants. If we allow the industry, the renewable energy industry, to compete on level playing fields and allow them to be a part of those markets, they're going to outproduce at a better price some of the monopolistic energy companies that we have out there. It's interesting, I'll be very quick, but in the legislature, when business lobbyists come to me, I'd say 90% of the time, they're lobbying for monopolies. They're lobbying for some sort of economic advantage. They're not for free enterprise, they're for themselves. And in the energy sector, that applies as well. So we need to have a new entrepreneurial spirit when it comes to energy production.
This summer, algae blooms once again threaten Florida's tourism industry and the health of our freshwater lakes, canals, and our beaches. The Florida legislature has been trying to deal with this issue for several years now. What sorts of solutions would you propose or support if elected?
Well, having sponsored the Everglades Restoration Act, I learned a lot about the need to restore Florida's natural environment in terms of our floodplains and the way we manage our water systems. That's $1 billion appropriation, $1 billion program. We've got to restore the St. Johns Basin, we got to restore the Florida Everglades, keep more water in those two locations that were designed to have water in them, designed by God. And because we diverted so much water out of the Everglades, we diverted so much water out of the St. Johns Basin into our estuaries with Indian River Lagoon, Florida Bay. It's causing a tremendous amount of algae to bloom because of the nutrient loading that's coming from those sources. So we must continue in what we're doing in restoring waters to flow back to those natural systems and preserve. That's a win-win. We preserve one natural system, actually we preserve two by protecting the originating source of that water.
And I'll just continue Representative Altman's statement with nutrient overload, with what's causing those algae blooms. And so we have to address what is all the nutrients that are going into whatever water system we're looking at that's causing the algae blooms. Biosolids, human waste, agriculture is a huge one for Lake Okeechobee that we need to address. So we need to make sure that we're trying to reduce it at its source. And then for the Indian River Lagoon, it's going to be muck removal, trying to reduce the nutrients that are in there, and septic and sewer.
In 2009, shortly before the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf, the Florida legislature moved to open our nearshore waters to offshore oil and gas exploration. Now, on the ballot in November, the Constitutional Revision Committee has placed an amendment to permanently ban nearshore drilling off our coast. What is your position on nearshore drilling?
It's an easy one for me because I actually lobbied with the CRC and spoke at when they were here in town. And that was one of the issues I spoke on. I wanted to see them put on the ballot no drilling offshore. And I felt that that's an issue that shouldn't be weighed upon depending on who the legislature is or who your governor is or even who the administration is at Washington, D.C. It should be something that's protected in our state constitution. So I lobbied the CRC for that, and I'm glad to see that on the ballot. Hopefully it'll get passed.
I support it wholeheartedly, and I hope it passes. But we also not only need to look at nearshore, but further offshore. And hopefully we can get a federal government that continues to fight those offshore drilling, especially in the Gulf. You know, probably the greatest economic engine in Florida is our military. And we have one of the greatest ranges in the world off the coast of Western Florida in the Panhandle. And the Air Force Base, the Naval Training Center, those military installations, deem those to be invaluable. They are probably the strongest advocates against any sort of oil drilling in the Gulf south of Florida is our active duty military. It would have a devastating effect on our armed forces to be able to prepare themselves and to train.
The state legislature has implemented or attempted to implement a number of preemptions on environmental issues. Preemptions on regulating plastic bags, fertilizers, and polystyrene, which is styrofoam. What is your opinion on home rule versus state control on environmental, especially in regards to sea level rise issues?
I came from local government as a county commissioner. I support home rule. I understand there must be limitations. It's not an absolute, but as a rule, I'm very supportive of the concept that government closest to the people governs best, that Jeffersonian principle. I supported the ability of local governments to regulate plastic bags, for example. I think it's a great opportunity to see how well that works. So I support that. I think it goes right back to what I mentioned earlier. We got to look at the top end of the waste stream. We always seem to focus at the bottom end, and a lot of times it's too late. So I think local governments do provide an opportunity to implement some really innovative ways of protecting the environment.
Yes, I spoke on this already, and I'll repeat myself, and I agree with Representative Altman. The best way for us to govern is to hear from what's happening at the local level issues in the municipalities first. We're kind of seeing it from the 30,000-foot view. We're not always seeing it in Tallahassee, what's going to happen locally. So I support home rule and local municipalities to be able to write the ordinances that they see fit in their areas, and then hopefully support them for Tallahassee.
This next one is an audience question. How would you address the impacts of sea level rise on low-income communities?
So those are the communities that are going to need the most help. Like I started to mention, if that's a home that's been lived in for the last 50 years and homesteaded, and they're in a coastal community and they've lived in their home, they're going to be the ones that are going to need the most help if they need to move, or if they're getting an area that's not being beach renourished. Those are the ones that are going to need the most help. And there's going to be hopefully ways to do that. If not, we can look at other funding sources, affordable housing sources. There's trust funds for those. So yeah, I would definitely look to trying to make sure we help that community out the most first. And even if we did with a carbon fee and dividend, they would be the ones that would be impacted the most from the dividends that they would be reaping from those.
We need to look at programs such as the Sadowski funds from documentary stamps. Some of that's directed toward low-income housing. That fund has been scrubbed. Some of that money's been diverted out of it. We need to restore some of that funding to help those who live in our low-value housing areas. But it will be an extra challenge. So many of the low-income do not own their own property. They're in rental property. So many do not live in some of the higher risk areas along the coast, but they may live in some of the low-lying areas. And we must continue to, again, good land use patterns. And as we retreat from a rising water, it's important that we implement really good land use planning in those areas that they're moving to. More concentric development, higher densities, that makes services much more affordable to provide.
We're starting to run out of time here, but we have time for a few more questions. Do you support increasing state funding for sea level rise research, and what research would you prioritize?
Well, I would. I think what we approved this last legislative session, our legislative delegation worked together very well to get a $17 million appropriation on LIDAR mapping, a very, very innovative way of mapping terrain. It's a radar type system. It's been revolutionized by companies like Harris Corporation. That's a beginning. We need to have adequate stormwater management plans and drainage plans and subbasin plans. We need to understand the way the water moves. And that's probably the beginning. But we also need a lot of federal funding, and it begins, I think, with NOAA and NASA. We've seen a threat to those Earth-based space missions, and we need to ensure that NASA continues their efforts to do Earth sciences through the type of launches, satellite systems that will help us study and understand our planet.
Yes, I also would support from the state level funding for sea level rise. And I think, as again, Representative Altman started to allude to, I think one of the most pressing issues are going to be storm surge from hurricanes as we keep on seeing more higher grade hurricanes coming about. We're seeing the direct effects of those. We're already, 100-year hurricanes and 100 years. Every time we see one, it's a devastating effect. So that's where I'd see we probably need the first funding sources. But again, I go to the scientists and see where they said, we need money allocated because these are the things that are most pressing when we're looking at sea level rise.
So this audience question was asked to the other group of candidates. How do you simply define sustainability? What is sustainability?
So for me, sustainability, if I can say it, sustainability is the human impact on the environment. And if we have a greater impact on the environment than we can manage, then we're not being sustainable. If we're drawing more water from our aquifer, then we're not being sustainable. If we're creating more greenhouse gases than the earth can manage, then we're not being sustainable. So sustainability to me is just the direct impact that we as humans have on our environment on the earth.
Well, we hear a lot about sustainability, and I tell you, sustainability is not good enough anymore. We've passed that threshold. We don't want to sustain the lagoon the way it is. We can't sustain our climate the way it is. The loss of our species, or the number of threatened species, or the loss of habitat. We can't sustain that. We got to draw back. We got to improve our environment where we are, develop that benchmark, and then sustain that level. To me, sustainability means we live on a planet that we know for our lifetime and the lifetime of generations to come, we have an environmentally sound world to live in. I grew up here and I watched so much of Brevard be destroyed. It was heartbreaking. I want to live in a world where we don't have to worry about that we know that our Earth, Mother Earth, will be there for us in its grandeur for our generations, all generations to come.
Okay, let's do one more. What do you think the role of state government is in mitigating coastal flooding?
Well, I think the biggest role right now is working with our federal partners through the federal flood insurance program. We know that these flood events, just like the fire events that we're seeing on the West Coast, they move to different parts of the country, and one community alone cannot harbor that on their shoulders. We must spread that burden out on the nation as a whole. So to ensure that their federal partners are at the table, and we continue to adequately fund our federal flood insurance programs, and that we have the resources to work with those partners to manage those, to ensure that we can respond and also have the mitigation plans in effect to prevent.
And when I think of the flood areas, it's a more proactive approach when we know that from the new maps we see and from the flooding that we're getting from these storms, we know that these areas are flooding, so we want to make sure that we're doing whatever we can proactively to make sure that we're not having population growth there in these new areas. So conservation, again, working federally to try to get some dollars for conservation, and any way we can at the state level.
Okay, thank you, candidates. Round of applause.